Hannah Arendt begins her philosophy by confronting a terrifying possibility: that evil may not always emerge from monstrous people driven by hatred or madness, but from ordinary individuals who stop thinking deeply about what they are doing. And this realization becomes the center of her understanding of modern political life, because she sees that the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century were not caused only by violent leaders or fanatic ideologies, but also by millions of people who surrendered their judgment, adapted themselves to systems, followed procedures, obeyed routines, and gradually lost the inner dialogue that allows a human being to distinguish right from wrong independently of authority or social pressure. For her, thinking is not merely intellectual activity or academic reflection, but an essential condition of moral existence itself. Because when individuals stop examining their actions and stop questioning the world around them, they become capable of participating in terrible things without fully realizing what they are doing. And this is what unsettles her most deeply: the idea that human beings can commit immense harm not through passionate cruelty, but through emptiness, through thoughtlessness, through the quiet refusal to engage seriously with the consequences of their own behavior. This understanding grows from her observation of totalitarianism, which she does not treat as simply another form of dictatorship or tyranny, but as something historically new and profoundly different, a system that seeks not only to control political power, but to dominate reality itself, destroying the distinction between truth and fiction, public and private life, individual and mass, until human beings lose the stable ground necessary for independent judgment. And within such a system, people become isolated from one another, disconnected from meaningful relationships and common reality, making them far easier to manipulate. She notices that loneliness plays a crucial role in this process, not ordinary solitude, which can allow reflection and creativity, but a deeper condition where individuals feel cut off from genuine human connection and from any shared understanding of the world. And in this loneliness, people become vulnerable to ideologies that offer certainty, identity, and belonging, even when those ideologies demand obedience and erase individuality, because the desire to escape isolation can become stronger than the desire for truth. What disturbs her is that modern society itself often creates the conditions for this isolation. As traditional communities weaken, public life declines, and individuals retreat into private concerns, losing the experience of meaningful participation in a common world. And without this shared public space, people begin to experience themselves less as citizens engaged in collective reality and more as isolated individuals focused primarily on survival, success, or personal comfort, leaving political life increasingly empty and vulnerable to manipulation. She believes that human beings are fundamentally political creatures, not in the narrow sense of party politics or government, but in the deeper sense that people realize their humanity through action and speech, among others, through appearing in public, expressing ideas, debating, creating, promising, forgiving, and participating in a shared world where individuals reveal who they are through their interactions. And without this active participation, life becomes diminished, reduced to mere existence rather than meaningful human experience. This distinction leads her to separate human activity into different dimensions: labor, work, and action, each representing a different relationship to the world and to existence itself. Labor concerns the endless biological processes necessary for survival, the repetitive cycle of maintaining life, eating, producing, consuming, and sustaining the body. Work creates the durable world of objects, buildings, institutions, and culture that gives stability to human existence. But action, for her, stands above both, because it is through action that freedom appears, through unpredictable interaction between individuals who initiate something new in the public realm. Freedom, therefore, is not simply private choice or personal independence, but the ability to begin something unexpected in the presence of others, to act in ways that interrupt automatic processes and create new possibilities. And this capacity for beginning becomes central to her vision of humanity, because every birth introduces someone capable of starting something that did not exist before, someone capable of altering the course of events through words and deeds that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. She is deeply suspicious of systems that attempt to eliminate unpredictability from human affairs, because such systems inevitably seek to reduce individuals into manageable units, sacrificing spontaneity, plurality, and freedom for the sake of order and efficiency. And while modern societies often celebrate organization and administration as signs of progress, she sees a hidden danger in this obsession with control, because the more life becomes dominated by bureaucratic systems, technical management, and impersonal procedures, the more difficult it becomes for genuine political action to exist. Bureaucracy particularly concerns her because it creates situations where no individual appears personally responsible, where decisions emerge from systems rather than visible human judgment, and within such structures people often stop asking moral questions, believing themselves to be merely fulfilling roles or executing functions. And this diffusion of responsibility allows harmful actions to proceed without clear accountability, as individuals psychologically distance themselves from the consequences of what they are helping to produce. She also fears the collapse of truth in political life, recognizing that when societies lose respect for factual reality, public discourse itself begins to disintegrate, because politics depends upon at least some shared understanding of the world. And if facts become endlessly manipulated, denied, or replaced by narratives designed purely for emotional effect or ideological loyalty, individuals lose the ability to orient themselves within reality, becoming increasingly vulnerable to propaganda and collective irrationality. At the same time, she refuses to reduce human beings to victims of historical forces or systems, because she insists that individuals always retain the capacity for judgment and action, even under immense pressure. And this insistence is crucial to her philosophy because it preserves the possibility of responsibility. The idea that human beings are never completely absolved by circumstance and must continually confront the question of what they are choosing to support, ignore, resist, or tolerate. For her, the danger of modern life lies partly in the tendency to escape this burden of judgment, to seek comfort in conformity, ideology, or routine, because genuine thinking is difficult and often unsettling, requiring individuals to stand apart from collective opinion and confront uncertainty without guarantees. And many prefer the security of belonging to the discomfort of independent reflection, even when that belonging demands moral compromise. Yet despite her awareness of catastrophe, her philosophy does not collapse into despair, because she believes the human capacity for beginning remains irreducible, that even after destruction, individuals retain the ability to create new political realities, rebuild shared worlds, and restore meaning through action and speech. And this belief in human natality, the constant possibility of new beginnings, becomes her answer to the darkness of modern history, not naive optimism, but a recognition that history is never fully closed because human beings themselves are unpredictable sources of renewal. As her philosophy moves deeper into the nature of political existence, she becomes increasingly concerned with the disappearance of the public world itself, because she believes that human beings require more than private comfort or economic security in order to live fully human lives. They require a shared space where individuals can appear before one another as distinct persons, where ideas can be spoken openly, where disagreement can exist without annihilation, and where action becomes meaningful through visibility and recognition. And when this public realm weakens, society may continue functioning materially, while something essential to human freedom quietly disappears. She sees modern life steadily pushing people away from this public existence and back into purely private concerns, where existence becomes centered around work, consumption, career, survival, entertainment, and personal advancement. And while none of these are inherently evil, they create a condition where individuals become absorbed in maintaining life rather than shaping the world. reducing politics into something distant, technical, and administrative instead of something living and participatory. And as this withdrawal expands, citizens slowly transform into spectators, watching public events rather than actively contributing to them. This transformation deeply troubles her because she believes freedom only truly exists through participation, not in isolation, and a society where people are politically passive, even if materially prosperous, gradually loses the habits necessary for self-government. Because freedom is not a possession that remains secure once achieved, it survives only through continuous exercise, through the willingness of individuals to speak, judge, debate, organize, and act together despite uncertainty and disagreement. She notices that modern societies increasingly redefine freedom in purely private terms, as personal choice, lifestyle preference, or protection from interference, but she believes this definition is incomplete because it ignores the public dimension of freedom, the experience of acting collectively in ways that shape the world itself. And without this dimension, individuals may feel personally independent while remaining politically powerless, disconnected from the forces organizing their common reality. Her concern with mass society emerges from this understanding, because mass society dissolves the distinctions between individuals, transforming people into interchangeable units connected less by meaningful relationships than by shared consumption, shared media, and shared reactions. And within such a society, loneliness paradoxically grows stronger even while communication becomes constant. Because true political life requires not mere contact, but genuine plurality, the encounter between distinct individuals capable of expressing different perspectives within a common space. Plurality becomes one of her most important ideas because she sees it as the basic condition of politics itself. Human beings are equal enough to understand one another, yet different enough that no single perspective can ever fully contain reality. And because of this, political life depends upon the coexistence of multiple viewpoints, multiple voices, multiple interpretations of the world. And any system that seeks to eliminate this plurality in favor of absolute unity or total agreement inevitably moves toward domination. This is why totalitarian systems horrify her so deeply, because they do not merely suppress opposition. They attempt to erase spontaneity and uniqueness entirely, reducing human beings into predictable elements within ideological systems. And in doing so, they attack the very condition that makes politics possible, because politics exists only where plurality exists, where unpredictable individuals interact freely rather than functioning as extensions of a single doctrine or authority. She observes that ideology plays a dangerous role in this process because ideologies offer simplified explanations for the complexity of reality, reducing history into mechanical laws and human beings into categories. And once individuals fully surrender themselves to ideological thinking, they stop engaging with reality directly, interpreting every event through predetermined formulas rather than independent judgment. And this rigid thinking gradually destroys the ability to encounter the world honestly, replacing thought with automatic interpretation. For her, genuine thinking requires openness, an internal dialogue where individuals question themselves continuously rather than clinging desperately to certainty. And this inner dialogue forms the basis of conscience, because a person who truly thinks must live with themselves, must face their own judgments and contradictions, and cannot completely escape responsibility through obedience or conformity. Whereas thoughtlessness allows individuals to separate themselves from their actions, psychologically, performing harmful acts while avoiding deeper reflection on what those acts mean. She is especially fascinated by the fragility of civilization itself, recognizing how quickly societies can descend into barbarism when public institutions collapse, truth loses authority, and individuals become detached from one another. And this fragility reveals something unsettling about human history, that progress is never guaranteed, that culture and morality do not advance automatically, and that every generation remains vulnerable to the same forces of fear, isolation, resentment, and ideological seduction that produced past catastrophes. Yet even while confronting these dangers, she refuses to define humanity purely through destruction or suffering, because she continues returning to the idea of beginning, the miraculous fact that human beings are capable of initiating something new, and this capacity for beginning exists not only in dramatic revolutions or historic moments, but in everyday acts of speech and action where individuals interrupt predictable patterns and create unforeseen possibilities through courage and participation. Forgiveness becomes important within this framework because human action is inherently unpredictable and irreversible. And without forgiveness, human beings would remain trapped forever within the consequences of past mistakes, unable to move forward, while promises become equally important because they create stability within uncertainty, allowing individuals to trust one another enough to act together despite the unpredictability of the future. And through these capacities, promising and forgiving, people create islands of continuity and renewal within the unstable flow of political life. She also reflects on the relationship between thinking and solitude, understanding that meaningful judgment requires moments of withdrawal from collective pressure, because individuals who are never alone with themselves easily become absorbed into public opinion, reacting automatically to the surrounding environment rather than developing independent thought. And yet solitude alone is not enough either, because thinking ultimately returns to the shared world, where ideas must encounter others through dialogue and action. This balance between solitude and public engagement becomes central to her vision of a healthy political existence, because human beings require both the inner space necessary for reflection and the public space necessary for participation. And when either disappears, life becomes distorted, either collapsing into isolated inwardness or dissolving in a thoughtless conformity shaped entirely by external pressures. As her philosophy unfolds further, it becomes increasingly clear that she sees modern civilization standing within a profound tension, possessing immense technological power and organizational capacity, while simultaneously risking the erosion of the very qualities that make political freedom meaningful. And beneath all her reflections runs the same persistent question: whether human beings can preserve the courage to think and act as distinct individuals within systems that continuously encourage passivity, conformity, and escape from responsibility. As this tension deepens, her philosophy turns toward one of the most difficult questions in modern existence: whether human beings still possess the capacity to encounter reality directly in a world increasingly dominated by systems, abstractions, and manufactured narratives. Because she senses that modern life steadily places layers between individuals and the world itself, replacing immediate experience with ideology, replacing judgment with information, and replacing participation with observation, until people begin living at a distance from reality, interpreting events through prefabricated frameworks rather than through thoughtful engagement. This concerns her because she believes reality reveals itself only through the shared experience of plural human perspectives, through conversation, disagreement, testimony, memory, and action within a common world. And when these living encounters weaken, society becomes vulnerable to forms of unreality where facts lose stability and truth becomes increasingly shaped by power, repetition, and emotional manipulation rather than by honest confrontation with what exists. She understands that lying has always existed in politics, but what alarms her about the modern world is the emergence of organized systems capable of reshaping entire realities on a massive scale, where propaganda no longer merely hides the truth, but constructs alternative worlds that people gradually inhabit psychologically. And once individuals lose confidence in their own ability to distinguish truth from fabrication, they become deeply disoriented, easier to manipulate because they no longer trust either public institutions or their own judgment fully. In this atmosphere, cynicism spreads quietly. People stop believing in truth altogether and begin assuming that every statement is merely strategy, every idea merely manipulation, every public act merely performance. And while this cynicism may appear intelligent or realistic, she sees it as profoundly dangerous because a society that no longer believes truth matters eventually loses the foundation required for meaningful political life, leaving only competing forces struggling for influence within an increasingly hollow public sphere. At the same time, she recognizes another danger emerging from modern conditions: the reduction of human beings into purely social or economic creatures, where individuals are valued primarily according to productivity, utility, efficiency, or statistical categories rather than as unique persons capable of thought and action. And within such systems, individuality becomes increasingly difficult to sustain because institutions naturally prefer predictability over spontaneity, management over uncertainty, and standardization over plurality. She fears that technological and bureaucratic systems intensify this tendency by encouraging people to view themselves and others impersonally, as functions within larger mechanisms rather than as morally responsible individuals. And this impersonal perspective allows enormous structures of power to operate while diffusing responsibility so completely that no one feels fully accountable for the consequences they produce, creating societies where harmful outcomes emerge not necessarily from malicious intentions, but from fragmented systems in which each person performs a limited role without confronting the larger reality their actions support. This fragmentation also alters the experience of meaning itself. When life becomes organized primarily around process, productivity, and administration, individuals often begin to feel disconnected from any deeper sense of purpose, as though existence has become efficient but spiritually empty, filled with movement yet lacking direction. And in this emptiness, people become increasingly susceptible to mass movements, ideological identities, and simplified narratives that promise certainty, belonging, and emotional clarity within an otherwise fragmented world. She notices how easily fear accelerates this process because frightened societies often prefer certainty over freedom, unity over plurality, and obedience over complexity, especially during moments of instability when ambiguity feels unbearable. And under such conditions, many individuals willingly surrender independent judgment in exchange for psychological security, convincing themselves that conformity is necessary for survival. And once this habit forms, it can persist long after the immediate crisis has passed. Yet she continues insisting that the human condition cannot be reduced entirely to these forces because unpredictability remains permanently embedded within political life itself. Human beings are never completely controllable because each person retains the capacity to interrupt established patterns through action, speech, and judgment, and this unpredictability frustrates all systems seeking total domination, because no structure can entirely eliminate the possibility of new beginnings emerging unexpectedly from individuals acting together. Her concept of action, therefore, becomes increasingly profound because action represents more than political behavior. It represents the appearance of human freedom within the world itself. The moment where individuals reveal who they are not through fixed identities or social categories, but through deeds and words that initiate something unforeseen, and because action always occurs among others. It creates networks of relationships whose consequences cannot be fully predicted or controlled, making political life permanently open rather than mechanically determined. This openness gives history its fragile unpredictability. No system, ideology, or historical theory can fully account for the spontaneous character of human action, because every generation introduces new individuals capable of altering existing trajectories in ways no one can foresee completely. And this means that even during periods of darkness or conformity, the possibility of renewal never entirely disappears. She also reflects more deeply on courage, understanding it not simply as physical bravery, but as the willingness to appear publicly as oneself, to risk judgment, misunderstanding, rejection, or isolation in order to speak honestly and act authentically within the shared world. And this courage becomes increasingly rare in societies dominated by mass opinion, because individuals fear exclusion more than they fear falsehood, preferring social acceptance over truthful expression. For her, genuine political life requires this courage, because plurality can survive only if individuals are willing to reveal distinct perspectives rather than dissolving themselves into collective identities. And when people stop speaking honestly out of fear, public space gradually empties of meaningful discourse, becoming filled instead with slogans, performances, and carefully managed expressions designed to avoid conflict while concealing deeper realities. Despite all these dangers, her philosophy never abandons the possibility of hope, though her hope is radically different from optimism. She does not believe history automatically improves or that progress inevitably leads toward justice. Instead, hope exists because human beings remain capable of beginning again, capable of rebuilding shared worlds even after destruction, capable of recovering truth after deception, and capable of restoring political freedom through renewed participation and judgment. This hope is fragile because it depends entirely upon human action rather than historical guarantees. Nothing ensures that societies will choose freedom over conformity or truth over illusion. And this uncertainty is precisely what makes responsibility unavoidable, because every generation must decide again whether it will preserve the conditions necessary for thinking, plurality, and meaningful political life, or whether it will slowly surrender those conditions in exchange for comfort, certainty, and passive security. And so her thought moves steadily toward a vision of human existence defined not by inevitability, but by responsibility itself, where the future remains permanently open because human beings remain capable of acting differently, thinking differently, and beginning differently, even within worlds shaped by immense pressures toward conformity and control. As her philosophy reaches its deepest point, everything begins to return to a single fragile question: what kind of world human beings are creating together through their presence, their silence, their actions, and their refusal to act? Because she understands that the world is not merely a physical environment or a political structure, but a shared human reality held together by memory, truth, institutions, relationships, promises, language, and the continuous willingness of individuals to care for something beyond themselves. And when this care disappears, the world does not collapse all at once, but slowly loses its durability, becoming unstable, fragmented, and vulnerable to forces that reduce human beings into isolated masses drifting without orientation. She sees modern civilization increasingly threatened by this loss of worldliness, where individuals become so absorbed in private survival, consumption, personal advancement, and endless activity that they no longer experience themselves as responsible participants in a common reality. And once this withdrawal becomes widespread, public life empties of substance, leaving political space open to manipulation by systems, ideologies, and movements that promise meaning while demanding obedience, certainty while destroying plurality, and belonging while erasing individuality. For her, one of the most dangerous illusions of modern life is the belief that responsibility belongs primarily to leaders, institutions, or abstract systems rather than ordinary individuals. Because this belief allows people to psychologically separate themselves from the consequences of the world they help sustain every day through compliance, indifference, silence, or passive adaptation. And it is precisely this separation that permits destructive structures to grow without encountering meaningful resistance, as individuals convince themselves that they are too small, too powerless, or too disconnected to matter. Against this, she insists that political responsibility begins at the level of judgment itself, within the quiet internal dialogue where individuals decide whether they are willing to live with what they support, ignore, or tolerate. And this dialogue becomes the foundation of conscience, because a person who genuinely thinks cannot completely detach themselves from their actions without fracturing their own relationship to reality, whereas thoughtlessness allows people to move through systems, mechanically performing roles without confronting what those roles produce. This is why she places such importance on thinking. Not because thinking guarantees moral behavior, but because the absence of thinking creates conditions where evil can become ordinary, where harmful actions lose their moral weight and become transformed into routine procedures carried out by individuals who no longer pause to ask what they are truly participating in. And this ordinariness disturbs her more deeply than open fanaticism, because it reveals how fragile moral awareness can become within highly organized societies. Yet even while recognizing this fragility, she continues returning to the idea of natality, the human capacity for beginning. Because for her, every birth introduces someone entirely new into the world, someone capable of initiating actions and ideas that cannot be predicted in advance. And this constant arrival of new beginnings prevents history from ever becoming fully closed or mechanically determined, ensuring that no system of domination can ever achieve total permanence. She believes this capacity for beginning appears most fully when individuals act together freely, not as isolated masses driven by ideology or fear, but as distinct persons engaged in the difficult process of building and sustaining a shared world despite disagreement and uncertainty. And within such action there exists a kind of miracle, the appearance of something genuinely new that interrupts the automatic flow of events and opens possibilities that previously did not exist. Freedom, therefore, remains inseparable from plurality because no individual can create a political world alone. Human beings require one another not only practically but existentially, since reality itself becomes richer and more complete when seen through multiple perspectives. And this plurality is not a problem to overcome, but the very condition that makes politics meaningful, because a world inhabited by identical minds would cease to be truly human, losing the unpredictability, dialogue, and creative tension through which freedom appears. She understands, however, how difficult it is to preserve this plurality in societies increasingly shaped by mass opinion, technological mediation, bureaucratic systems, and ideological polarization, all of which pressure individuals towards simplification and conformity. And yet she refuses the temptation to retreat into cynicism, because cynicism itself becomes another form of surrender, another way of abandoning responsibility by assuming meaningful action is impossible. Instead, she holds on to a more demanding form of hope, one rooted not in guarantees or historical progress, but in the continued existence of human capacities themselves, the capacities to think, judge, speak truthfully, forgive, promise, remember, and act courageously even under difficult conditions. And these capacities remain alive wherever individuals refuse to abandon their inner dialogue or withdraw entirely from the shared world. She also recognizes that freedom can never be perfectly secured because every political order remains vulnerable to decay, manipulation, and the gradual erosion of public life. And this vulnerability is permanent because human beings themselves are finite, flawed, and susceptible to fear, conformity, and exhaustion. Yet this same vulnerability also makes freedom meaningful, because a freedom that required no effort, no courage, and no responsibility would no longer be truly political or truly human. In the end, her philosophy leaves behind neither a system nor a final doctrine, but a warning and a possibility existing side by side. The warning is that modern societies can slowly create conditions where individuals become disconnected from thinking, from reality, from one another, and from responsibility itself, allowing domination to emerge not only through violence, but through passivity, loneliness, and the quiet collapse of judgment. The possibility is that human beings remain capable of interrupting this process through conscious action, through the courage to appear publicly as distinct individuals, and through the refusal to surrender their capacity for thought even when conformity feels safer. And so her vision of human existence remains permanently unfinished, resting upon the fragile but enduring truth that every generation enters a world it did not create yet still possesses the ability to renew it, damage it, or transform it through the choices it makes together. And within this uncertainty lies both the danger and the dignity of political life itself. because the future is never completely decided while human beings still retain the power to begin. Most people believe the greatest dangers in history come from monsters, cruel men, violent fanatics, obvious evil standing in plain sight. But Hannah Arendt spent her life discovering something far more disturbing. She discovered that some of the worst horrors in human history were not created by demons at all, but by ordinary people who stopped thinking deeply about what they were doing. People who followed routines, people who obeyed systems, people who became so absorbed in fitting into society that they slowly lost the ability to confront reality with their own conscience. And once you understand her, it becomes impossible to look at modern life the same way again, because Arendt forces an uncomfortable question into the center of human existence. What happens when entire societies become emotionally numb? What happens when people become more loyal to systems than to truth? What happens when loneliness becomes so widespread that individuals begin surrendering their freedom simply to feel connected to something larger than themselves? Hannah Arendt was not born into a peaceful world of abstract philosophy. She was born into collapse, into instability, into one of the most violent centuries human civilization had ever produced. And unlike many philosophers who built theories from safe distances, Arendt watched history tear itself apart with her own eyes. She witnessed democracies decay from within. She witnessed ordinary citizens slowly adapt themselves to authoritarianism. She witnessed intellectuals become servants of ideology. She witnessed neighbors stop seeing one another as human beings. Her philosophy was not detached speculation. It was an attempt to understand how civilization itself could become psychologically sick. She was born in 1906 in Germany, into a Jewish family living in a Europe already trembling beneath the surface. At the time, many educated Europeans still believed history was progressing toward reason, enlightenment, and stability. There was enormous faith in science, technology, bureaucracy, and modern civilization. People believed humanity was becoming more rational, more civilized, more advanced. But beneath this optimism, something darker was quietly growing. Industrialization had transformed society faster than human psychology could adapt. Traditional communities were weakening. Religious certainty was fading. Millions of people felt spiritually uprooted without fully understanding why. The modern world gave individuals more freedom than ever before, but it also created isolation, anxiety, and disconnection on a massive scale. People were no longer deeply anchored in small communities, shared traditions, or stable identities. They were becoming individuals in enormous, impersonal societies. And that loneliness would become one of the central themes of Arendt's entire philosophy. As a child, Arendt was intellectually gifted and emotionally intense. She was drawn toward thinking not simply as an academic exercise, but as a way of surviving reality itself. Her early life was marked by loss when her father died from illness while she was still young. Her mother raised her with unusual independence and encouraged intellectual seriousness. Arendt grew up in an atmosphere where thinking deeply was treated almost like a moral responsibility. This matters because Hannah Arendt would later argue that genuine thinking is not merely intelligence. It is not the accumulation of facts. It is not academic expertise. Thinking, for her, was something more dangerous and more human. It was the internal dialogue a person has with themselves when confronting reality honestly. The ability to stop, reflect, question, resist easy narratives, resist mass opinion, resist the comfort of conformity. And she believed that when societies stop encouraging this kind of thinking, people become vulnerable to manipulation in terrifying ways. As a young woman, Arendt entered universities during a period of enormous intellectual energy in Germany. Philosophy was alive in Europe then. Universities were filled with debates about meaning, existence, freedom, truth, and modernity. One of the most influential thinkers of the era was Martin Heidegger, a philosopher whose ideas about existence would profoundly shape Arendt's intellectual development. Heidegger believed modern people were disconnected from authentic existence. Human beings, he argued, spend most of their lives lost in routines, distractions, social expectations, and shallow public identities. Instead of confronting the reality of existence directly, most people hide inside habits and collective thinking. They allow society to think for them. This idea struck Arendt deeply because she could already sense modern life producing a kind of spiritual sleepwalking, a condition where people became functional without being fully awake to what they were doing. Arendt and Heidegger eventually developed a secret romantic relationship despite their age difference and his marriage. The relationship would become emotionally complicated and morally painful, especially later when Heidegger aligned himself with the Nazi regime. But intellectually, Heidegger shaped Arendt's early understanding of existence, alienation, and human authenticity. Still, Arendt would eventually move far beyond him. Where Heidegger focused heavily on individual existence, Arendt became obsessed with political life itself. She wanted to understand not only how individuals lose authenticity, but how entire societies lose their moral orientation together. And history was about to give her a horrifying laboratory. In the years after World War I, Germany descended into humiliation, economic devastation, instability, and rage. Inflation destroyed savings. Political violence spread through the streets. Trust in institutions collapsed. Millions of people felt abandoned by the old order, but uncertain about the future. The social fabric weakened. Fear became normal. Cynicism became fashionable. Many citizens no longer believed democratic systems could solve their problems. Arendt observed something psychologically important during this period. When people feel isolated, powerless, and disoriented for long enough, they begin craving certainty more than freedom. Freedom becomes exhausting when reality feels chaotic. Independent thinking becomes painful when social belonging feels threatened. In these conditions, ideologies become emotionally seductive. This is one of Arendt's deepest insights, and one that remains disturbingly relevant. People often imagine totalitarian movements succeed because populations are simply deceived by propaganda. But Arendt believed the truth was far more complicated. Totalitarianism feeds on loneliness. It feeds on atomized individuals who no longer feel meaningfully connected to one another or to reality itself. It offers identity to the isolated, simplicity to the confused, purpose to the lost, belonging to the alienated. And once people emotionally surrender themselves to an ideology, reality itself becomes less important than loyalty. This is why totalitarian systems become so psychologically dangerous. They do not merely control behavior. They reshape perception. They slowly train people to distrust their own judgment and replace it with the narrative of the movement. Arendt watched this happen in real time as Nazism rose across Germany. Many people later asked how ordinary citizens could tolerate such a regime, how neighbors could suddenly participate in cruelty, how educated individuals could support barbarism. But Arendt believed these questions misunderstood human nature. Civilization is far more fragile than people want to believe. Under enough fear, enough isolation, enough social pressure, enormous numbers of people can adapt themselves to horrifying systems while continuing to see themselves as normal. This terrified her because it suggested evil was not always committed by monstrous individuals driven by hatred alone. Sometimes evil emerged from thoughtlessness, from conformity, from the gradual erosion of moral reflection. As Nazi power expanded, Jewish citizens became increasingly excluded from public life. Rights disappeared step by step, not all at once, but gradually enough that many people psychologically adjusted to each new level of abnormality. This gradual adaptation fascinated Arendt because it revealed how human beings normalize almost anything when change happens incrementally. People often imagine tyranny arrives dramatically. But Arendt understood that societies usually drift into moral catastrophe slowly. One compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, one silence at a time. And perhaps most disturbing of all, many people continue pursuing ordinary life while the moral foundations beneath them collapse. They still go to work, still attend social gatherings, still focus on careers and routines. Human beings possess an astonishing ability to psychologically compartmentalize reality when confronting truth becomes too painful or socially dangerous. Arendt herself eventually fled Germany after being arrested briefly by the Gestapo for gathering evidence of anti-Semitic propaganda. She escaped first to Paris, becoming part of the enormous population of displaced people wandering through a collapsing Europe. Exile transformed her understanding of human vulnerability forever. To lose one's country is not merely to lose geography. It is to lose social recognition, legal protection, familiarity, continuity, identity. Stateless people occupied a terrifying position in the modern world because they no longer belonged fully anywhere. They existed in a kind of political invisibility. Arendt began realizing something deeply unsettling about human rights. People speak about rights as universal and permanent, but in practice, rights often depend entirely on political systems recognizing your humanity. Once a person loses citizenship, once they become politically abandoned, their supposed universal rights can vanish with shocking speed. This realization would later shape one of her most powerful ideas. The most fundamental human right is not any specific liberty, but the right to belong to a political community that recognizes your existence as meaningful and protected. Without that belonging, human beings become frighteningly vulnerable. While living in exile in France, Arendt witnessed Europe sliding further toward disaster. Refugees filled cities. Fear spread everywhere. Nations became increasingly nationalistic and suspicious. Human beings turned inward, protecting themselves psychologically from overwhelming instability. Then came the full collapse of civilization into World War II. The scale of destruction shattered assumptions about modern progress forever. Industrial society, advanced science, efficient bureaucracy, and educated populations had not prevented barbarism. In some ways, they had intensified it. Modern systems made destruction more organized, more efficient, more impersonal. Arendt fled again after the German invasion of France, eventually escaping to the United States. She arrived not as a celebrated philosopher, but as a refugee carrying the psychological scars of Europe's collapse. And in America, she began the work that would make her one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. She wanted to understand how totalitarianism had become possible at all. Not merely the historical details, but the deeper psychological and social conditions beneath it. What she discovered would challenge comforting illusions about human nature forever. By the time Hannah Arendt began writing seriously about totalitarianism, much of the world was still trying to emotionally process what had happened in Europe. The scale of the violence felt almost unreal. Entire cities destroyed, millions dead, concentration camps uncovered, bureaucratic systems engineered for industrial killing. And beneath the shock was an even deeper fear that disturbed Arendt more than anything else. The fear that these horrors were not historical accidents committed by a few insane individuals, but signs of something latent inside modern civilization itself. Most people wanted simple explanations. They wanted to believe Nazism emerged from uniquely evil personalities or from some kind of national madness disconnected from ordinary human life. Arendt resisted this comforting interpretation. She believed the conditions that produced totalitarianism were far more widespread and far more human than people wanted to admit. This made her dangerous as a thinker because she refused to allow society the comfort of moral distance. She argued that totalitarianism was not merely dictatorship in the traditional sense. Ancient tyrants wanted obedience. Traditional authoritarian rulers usually sought power, wealth, or control over territory. But totalitarian movements sought something much deeper. They sought to reshape reality itself. They attempted to dominate not only political life, but the inner world of human beings. Their goal was not simply to force obedience, but to eliminate the very space where independent thought could exist. This distinction mattered enormously to Arendt because it explained why 20th century totalitarian systems felt psychologically different from older forms of oppression. Under traditional tyranny, individuals might still preserve a private inner life. Families, friendships, religion, and personal reflection could survive beneath political repression. But totalitarian systems attempted to invade every layer of existence. They dissolved the boundary between public and private life. They turned neighbors into informants. They transformed language itself into propaganda. They isolated individuals from one another until people no longer trusted even their own perceptions. Arendt realized that once human beings become isolated enough, reality itself becomes unstable. This may sound abstract at first, but she believed loneliness was one of the most politically dangerous conditions a society could produce. Not solitude. Arendt carefully distinguished the two. Solitude can be peaceful, creative, reflective. A person alone with their thoughts may still feel internally connected to themselves and to reality. But loneliness is something darker. Loneliness is the feeling of being cut off from meaningful human connection and from shared reality itself. A lonely person becomes psychologically vulnerable because they begin craving certainty and belonging at almost any cost. This is why propaganda becomes so powerful during periods of social fragmentation. People often assume propaganda works by convincing rational minds through facts. Arendt understood that propaganda usually works emotionally long before it works intellectually. It offers simple explanations during confusion, clear enemies during uncertainty, identity during fragmentation, a sense of movement during stagnation. And once people become emotionally attached to an ideology, facts often lose their power. This was one of Arendt's most unsettling observations. Totalitarian movements train individuals to prioritize ideological consistency over reality itself. Contradictions no longer matter. Evidence no longer matters. Truth becomes flexible. The movement becomes the only stable source of meaning in a chaotic world. When this happens, human beings begin participating in systems they would once have considered unthinkable. Arendt understood that ideology functions almost like psychological armor against uncertainty. Modern life contains enormous ambiguity. Human beings are fragile creatures living in unstable societies, confronting mortality, suffering, economic insecurity, loneliness, and social competition. Genuine thinking requires confronting this uncertainty honestly, and many people find that emotionally exhausting. Ideologies relieve this burden by offering total explanations. Everything becomes simplified into narratives of enemies and heroes, purity and corruption, loyalty and betrayal. Complex human beings are reduced into categories. Reality becomes emotionally manageable. But this simplification comes at a catastrophic cost, because once people stop seeing others as fully human individuals, cruelty becomes easier to rationalize. Arendt became obsessed with understanding how systems transform ordinary people into participants in inhuman behavior. She did not believe most evil emerged from sadistic monsters. Truly monstrous individuals exist, of course, but societies cannot explain mass atrocities simply through individual pathology. Large systems require ordinary participants: clerks, administrators, police officers, secretaries, technicians, accountants, citizens who continue functioning normally while horrors unfold around them. And this forced Arendt toward one of the most controversial ideas of her life. In 1961, she traveled to Jerusalem to report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. Many expected to encounter a terrifying figure filled with hatred and ideological fanaticism. Instead, Arendt encountered something profoundly unsettling. Eichmann appeared disturbingly ordinary. He was not intellectually impressive. He did not appear demonic or insane. He often spoke in cliches and bureaucratic language. He described his role in logistical terms, as though organizing deportations were merely administrative tasks inside a system. Arendt was shocked not because Eichmann lacked guilt, but because he seemed incapable of genuinely thinking about the moral reality of his actions. This became the foundation of her famous and widely misunderstood phrase, the banality of evil. She did not mean evil is trivial. She meant that terrible crimes can be committed by psychologically ordinary individuals who stop engaging in reflective moral thought. Individuals who become absorbed in systems, routines, ambitions, obedience, and social conformity until they lose the capacity to confront what they are actually participating in. Eichmann was not a grand philosophical villain consumed by deep hatred every waking moment. He was, in Arendt's eyes, terrifyingly shallow. A man who replaced moral judgment with bureaucratic obedience. A man who spoke in mechanical language because genuine thinking had withered inside him. This horrified Arendt because it suggested modern society itself might encourage forms of thoughtlessness. Large bureaucratic systems divide responsibility into tiny fragments. One person signs papers, another organizes transportation, another processes records, another follows regulations. Each individual performs a narrow task while psychologically distancing themselves from the larger consequences. This fragmentation allows human beings to commit enormous harm while still perceiving themselves as normal and respectable. And suddenly Arendt's philosophy stops feeling historical and begins feeling uncomfortably contemporary. Because modern societies are increasingly bureaucratic, technological, and psychologically fragmented. Individuals often experience themselves as tiny components inside enormous systems they barely understand. Many people feel disconnected from the consequences of their labor. Decisions become procedural rather than moral. Language becomes managerial and impersonal. Human suffering is transformed into statistics, policies, algorithms, or abstractions. Arendt feared that when societies become too dominated by systems and administration, human beings gradually stop exercising moral judgment altogether. Not because they are inherently evil, but because they become passive. This passivity was central to her understanding of political danger. Human beings possess a frightening ability to adapt themselves to existing systems rather than confront them. Most people desperately want social stability, belonging, safety, predictability. Open moral resistance carries enormous psychological and social costs. It risks isolation, punishment, uncertainty, and fear. So many individuals slowly compromise themselves step by step until they barely recognize their own transformation. Arendt understood that moral collapse rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It often feels gradual, procedural, and socially normalized. A person tells themselves they are only following expectations, only preserving their career, only protecting their family, only obeying laws, only adapting to circumstances. And over time, the line between survival and complicity becomes dangerously blurred. What frightened Arendt most was not passionate hatred alone, but the absence of thinking, the absence of inner dialogue, the inability or unwillingness to stop and ask difficult moral questions. Can I live with what I am doing? Can I remain friends with myself after this? Because Arendt believed conscience is not simply obedience to external rules. Conscience emerges from the relationship a person has with their own inner life. A thinking person cannot entirely escape themselves. They must live internally with their decisions. This is why she believed genuine thinking has moral importance. Not academic intelligence, not expertise, not credentials. Some highly educated people participated enthusiastically in totalitarian systems. Education alone does not protect civilization. Thinking, for Arendt, meant the difficult practice of examining reality honestly without surrendering completely to ideology, conformity, or social pressure. And this process is exhausting. Many people prefer ready-made narratives because genuine thought creates uncertainty. Once a person begins thinking deeply, simple moral certainty often disappears. Human beings become complicated. Systems become morally ambiguous. Society becomes psychologically unsettling. But Arendt believed this discomfort is necessary for freedom. A society filled with individuals incapable of reflective thought becomes vulnerable to manipulation because people begin outsourcing judgment to authorities, movements, parties, technologies, or social consensus. This is why Arendt defended political freedom so passionately. She did not see politics merely as government administration. True politics, in her view, was the active participation of citizens speaking, debating, judging, and acting together in public life. Totalitarianism destroys this space by reducing individuals into isolated masses incapable of meaningful collective thought. And isolation, for Arendt, was always the beginning of danger, because isolated individuals become easier to control, easier to radicalize, easier to manipulate emotionally, easier to detach from reality. As she looked across the modern world after World War II, Arendt became increasingly concerned that many societies misunderstood freedom itself. People often defined freedom negatively, as merely the absence of interference. But Arendt believed genuine freedom required active participation in shared public life. Human beings become fully human not in isolation, but through action, speech, and engagement with others. Without this, societies drift toward passivity, and passive populations eventually become vulnerable populations. Arendt knew this vulnerability intimately because she had witnessed how quickly civilized societies could unravel when fear, loneliness, and ideological certainty combined together. The terrifying lesson of the 20th century was not simply that evil exists. Human beings always knew that. The terrifying lesson was that modern civilization itself could produce conditions where ordinary people slowly stop resisting it. As Hannah Arendt grew older, her philosophy became less focused on the machinery of totalitarianism alone and more focused on the deeper question of what kind of human life might resist it. She had spent years studying fear, conformity, loneliness, and ideological thinking, but beneath all of that was another concern quietly shaping her work. What allows human beings to remain spiritually alive inside mass society without becoming swallowed by it? Because Arendt did not believe freedom was guaranteed by constitutions alone. Laws matter, institutions matter, democratic systems matter, but none of them survive automatically. A society can preserve the appearance of democracy while its citizens slowly become passive, cynical, isolated, and emotionally detached from public life. And once enough people retreat inward, politics no longer belongs to citizens. It belongs to systems, bureaucracies, media structures, and ambitious individuals competing for power. Arendt noticed something deeply modern in this retreat. Many people no longer viewed public life as meaningful at all. Politics became exhausting noise. Society became something distant and impersonal. Individuals focused increasingly on private survival, personal comfort, career advancement, entertainment, and distraction. The shared world between people slowly weakened. To Arendt, this loss was catastrophic because human beings are not meant to live entirely private lives. A fully private existence eventually becomes psychologically narrow. People begin thinking only in terms of personal success, personal safety, personal opinion. They lose the habit of encountering different perspectives inside a shared public reality. And when this shared reality collapses, truth itself becomes fragile. This was another one of Arendt's unsettling insights. Truth is not sustained by facts alone. Facts matter enormously, but societies also require a collective willingness to care about reality in the first place. Once political tribes, ideological movements, or media systems become more emotionally important than truth itself, reality begins breaking apart into competing narratives. Arendt feared societies where citizens no longer distinguish between honest disagreement and total fabrication, because eventually exhausted populations stop searching for truth altogether. They simply choose whichever version of reality feels emotionally comforting or socially rewarding. And this creates ideal conditions for manipulation. She understood something psychologically painful about human beings. Many people would rather belong than think independently. Social exclusion feels terrifying at a biological level. Human beings evolved as deeply social creatures, and isolation can feel emotionally unbearable. This is why mass movements become so powerful. They offer identity, certainty, emotional belonging, and relief from the burden of standing alone. But Arendt admired individuals who preserve the courage to think independently even when surrounded by conformity. Not because they were fearless, but because they understood that surrendering conscience eventually destroys the self from within. For her, thinking was never cold intellectualism. It was an inner moral activity connected to human dignity itself. A thinking person develops the ability to pause before joining collective madness, to resist emotional contagion, to examine slogans carefully, to question authority without automatically worshiping rebellion either. This balance mattered deeply to Arendt because she distrusted all forms of blind fanaticism, even when disguised as righteousness. She had seen how quickly human beings divide the world into absolute good and evil, purity and corruption, allies and enemies. Once politics becomes entirely tribal, people stop seeing opponents as fellow human beings and begin seeing them as obstacles to eliminate. Language itself becomes harsher. Compassion narrows. Complexity disappears. And then societies slowly drift toward dehumanization without fully noticing it happening. Arendt understood that civilization depends on something fragile and difficult. The willingness of ordinary people to remain awake morally and psychologically even during periods of fear, anger, and uncertainty. Because history had taught her that the greatest dangers often emerge not when evil announces itself openly, but when exhaustion, conformity, loneliness, and thoughtlessness quietly spread through everyday life. As Hannah Arendt entered the later years of her life, her thinking became quieter, deeper, and in some ways more unsettling. She had spent decades studying totalitarianism, ideology, loneliness, obedience, and power, but beneath all of those subjects was a more intimate concern that never left her. She wanted to understand what allows a human being to remain inwardly alive inside a society constantly pulling people toward passivity and conformity. Because Arendt understood something many modern people try very hard not to think about. Human beings are fragile creatures psychologically shaped by the environments around them. Most individuals like to imagine themselves as independent thinkers with stable moral identities, but history repeatedly shows how quickly people adapt themselves to social pressure, fear, trends, institutions, and collective emotions. Entire populations can normalize cruelty if enough people around them treat it as normal. Entire societies can lose their relationship with truth if enough individuals become emotionally exhausted and stop caring whether something is true at all. This was one of Arendt's deepest fears. Not simply violent dictatorship, but the gradual erosion of the inner human world. The slow death of reflection. The disappearance of genuine thinking beneath noise, slogans, routine, and distraction. She believed modern society carried a dangerous temptation. The temptation to stop thinking deeply because thinking itself can become painful. Genuine thought forces people to confront uncomfortable realities about themselves, their societies, and the systems they participate in every day. It destroys easy certainty. It complicates simple narratives. It demands moral responsibility. And many people, consciously or unconsciously, try to escape that burden. Some escape into ideology. Others escape into endless work, entertainment, tribal politics, social approval, or constant distraction. Arendt noticed that modern life often leaves very little room for stillness or serious reflection. Individuals become absorbed in schedules, media, anxieties, ambitions, and public performance until they gradually lose contact with their own inner dialogue. But for Arendt, this inner dialogue was essential to being fully human. She believed conscience does not emerge automatically from laws, religion, education, or intelligence alone. Conscience emerges when a person maintains an active relationship with themselves. A thinking person develops the habit of silently examining their actions, their motives, and the moral reality around them. They become capable of pausing before simply following the crowd. Without this pause, human beings become dangerously adaptable. Arendt had seen how ordinary individuals could slowly drift into systems of cruelty without ever fully acknowledging what they were becoming. Not because they woke up wanting evil, but because they stopped resisting the emotional comfort of conformity. They stopped questioning the language around them, stopped examining the systems they served, stopped imagining the humanity of those being excluded or harmed. This process fascinated and horrified her because it revealed how evil often grows gradually beneath ordinary life rather than announcing itself dramatically. A society rarely collapses morally all at once. People adjust step by step. First, certain language becomes normal. Then certain prejudices become socially acceptable. Then fear spreads. Then independent thought becomes exhausting or dangerous. Then individuals begin self-censoring. Then silence becomes habitual. And eventually many people no longer remember what honest public life felt like before fear and conformity took over. Arendt believed one of the greatest protections against this process was human plurality, the existence of many different perspectives living together inside a shared public world. She believed healthy societies require disagreement, discussion, debate, and the difficult experience of encountering people unlike ourselves. Without this plurality, societies become intellectually rigid and emotionally tribal. This was why she cared so deeply about public life. Not politics in the narrow sense of parties and elections, but the broader human activity of citizens speaking openly, exchanging ideas, and participating in reality together. She believed freedom only truly exists when people can appear before one another honestly as thinking individuals rather than isolated private consumers or obedient members of ideological tribes. But modern society, in her view, often push people toward isolation instead. The more isolated individuals become, the easier they are to manipulate emotionally. Loneliness creates hunger for certainty and belonging. And once that hunger becomes intense enough, many people begin surrendering parts of themselves simply to escape feeling alone. This is why Arendt never viewed loneliness as merely a personal sadness. She saw it as a political condition with enormous consequences. Isolated people become vulnerable to mass movements because movements offer identity, purpose, and emotional direction. They transform confusion into certainty. They transform insecurity into collective belonging. Yet Arendt also believed human beings possess another possibility, the ability to begin again. This idea remained deeply important to her because after witnessing war, genocide, exile, and the collapse of entire civilizations, she refused to believe history was completely hopeless. Human beings are capable of destruction, but they are also capable of renewal. Every new generation enters the world with the potential to interrupt old patterns and create new realities through action, courage, and thought. For Arendt, freedom was inseparable from this human capacity for new beginnings. Not freedom as mere personal comfort or endless consumption, but freedom as the ability to act meaningfully in the world rather than drifting passively through systems built by others. And perhaps this is why Hannah Arendt continues to feel so relevant decades after her death, because the world she warned about never entirely disappeared. The pressure she described still surround modern life. The pressure to conform. The pressure to simplify reality into tribes and enemies. The pressure to replace reflection with reaction. the pressure to surrender independent judgment in exchange for belonging. Her philosophy remains disturbing because it refuses to flatter humanity. She reminds people that civilization is not automatically stable, morality is not automatic, and freedom is not self-sustaining. Every society depends on ordinary individuals continuing the difficult work of thinking honestly and remaining morally awake. And at the center of all her work is a quiet but powerful warning. The greatest danger to human beings may not always come from obvious monsters or dramatic acts of evil. Sometimes the danger comes from the slow disappearance of thought itself.